What did you do in the Great War, Grandpa?
Well, I put a Facebook rainbow up. We fought for our civil rights while sitting on the couch. There was no hashtag for that, sweetie.
All right, you ready?
Yes.
Okay, today is Monday, June 28th, 2015, and this is episode 121 of the Defensive Security Podcast. Nice palindrome there. And my name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Jerry, how are you?
Doing awesome. How are you?
Happy Monday to you. I'm doing all right. I'm finally over my plague that I appeared to have for months.
Well, good. Good. Polar bear flu is gone now.
Yeah, don't French kiss a polar bear. That's what I learned.
You know, they should teach you that in school.
But it's. I'll tell you, it's been a very eventful week in the news.
It has. Yes, it has.
And we're not covering any of that.
Nope. Well, I mean, except for maybe some of the security-related stuff.
Well, yes. Yeah, there's been a decent amount of security.
A few things. So before we get started into that, first order of business is that the thoughts and opinions we express on this podcast are ours and do not represent those of our employer. And the second order of business is the periodic reminder about the High Tech Crime Investigation Association. HTCIAconference.org happens August 30th through September 2nd, Orlando, Florida. Tickets are $750. We gave away our ticket. And I conveniently don't have the name right now, so sorry.
Well, perhaps I chose to be anonymous.
Yeah.
But congrats to our winner.
That's right. So getting into our stories for this evening. The first one comes from databreaches.net, and this is what appears to be a bulletin from the FBI, issued by the FBI, and they have a link to the actual PDF. This is a flash that the FBI puts out occasionally, and allegedly it contains some information about the tools and some of the techniques used in the OPM breach. And to be perfectly honest, the indicators are kind of yawners. What I thought was way more interesting was their recommendations. So they have a list of recommended mitigations. But I guess before I get into there, assuming this was the OPM breach, there was quite a lot of Trojans, and one piece of malware, which appears to be a privilege escalation bug. There's really no context about whether it was exploiting 0 days or how it came to be in their network. I think we can all use our imagination that it was probably an email.
I'm stunned to hear that.
I know. Or maybe, it came from the Secretary of State network, or who knows, right?
Well, the challenge is that if it started with an email, a lot of times these phishes then capture legitimate credentials, which make it much tougher to spot once they start being used.
Absolutely, that is for sure. And in fact, I think the OPM breach, at least one of the reports, which I think we talked about last time, there was a domain found, like opmtraining.com, which there appears to be linked to, at least superficially linked to the Anthem and the Primera breach. So almost certainly involving credential harvesting through phishing and probably also planting malware. This is like garden variety stuff anymore. Anyway, so some of the recommendations I thought were actually quite good. So I don't know if you had a chance to read them, but
Yep.
The first section was related to preparing your environment for incident response, and I've talked about this a couple of times. And one of the important things when you have a really or suspect a somewhat widespread outbreak or a breach is to establish an out-of-band communication method between your staff, because you don't want to use your email. Right?
Shouldn't technically you have that established ahead of time anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
But,
idea.
Worst case, if you haven't, go ahead and establish it before too far into the breach, sure. But
Right.
we saw a case not too long ago that we covered on the show where the bad guys had taken over the email system, and as the IT and security departments were trying to email updates out, the bad guys were then sending follow-up emails posing as the security team contramanding and such, which was epic.
Yeah,
So.
that was the Syrian Electronic Army.
Yeah.
They are really good at that.
They're clever.
So their next piece of advice was to make sure that your devices are all logging centrally. That's hopefully not a big revelation. Disable all remote access, so RDP and VPN. And God, I hope people aren't exposing RDP to the internet. But anyway, disabling all remote access until a password change has been completed.
What if you're using two-factor?
That certainly is a pretty big mitigation. And I hope you're using two-factor.
Yeah. Please, please.
Please, especially if you're doing RDP.
Well,
Talk about playing with matches. Wow. So next one I thought was really interesting and it's kind of controversial. Implement full SSL/TLS inspection capability.
no, this is so key. I was having a discussion on this the other day. If you encrypt everything everywhere, you blind a ton of your security devices. You've got to be able to look at this traffic. Otherwise, you're, in essence, completely encrypting the attack against the web server and all of your other technology to help defend the web server, whether it be IPSs, whether it be web application firewalls. If it can't look inside that TLS session to find attacks, it's doing you no good.
Yeah. And I think the other side of it too is when you look back up above in this advisory, they give you some some indicators of compromise, which appear to be things to look for. Your host beaconing out.
Right.
And again, if those are TLS encrypted, you're going to see the destination, but you're not going to see inside the packet. So that is a big problem. But at the same time, it's kind of controversial to be candid, especially in other countries. If you have, for instance, European operations, this kind of capability is pretty controversial.
Yeah, that may be the trade-off you have to make.
Yeah.
But if anything, I just want people to think about how holistically all these different technologies are going to work together and understand. Great, you have a DLP solution that's watching the network, except all the network traffic passing that point is encrypted. What is that DLP doing for you? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You just have to, because so many people just check the box. Well, hey, we've got DLP, but is it doing anything?
It's checking the box.
Ugh.
And again, if that's your case, you should be shopping for price, right? So the next recommendation is to monitor accounts and devices determined to be part of the compromise to prevent reacquisition attempts. And so this actually is something that's really very important in in the heat of an incident. When quite often you'll find a system that's been compromised and potentially accounts that have been compromised, and usually if you're diligent, you'll reset passwords and things like that. But depending on your philosophy on how you approach remediation, if you do reset a password, you'll want to watch to see if it's, if somebody's trying to take it back, and then figure out how they're doing that. Now, having said that, I think that in many respects, now granted, this is probably not feasible in a large organization, but it's very difficult, nay impossible, to incrementally eradicate something that's really pervasive from a network. You almost really need to do a big bang, shut it all off, clean it all up, turn it back on. And for Pete's sake, don't try to clean your computers.
It worked for Airwolf when it had Moffat's Ghost.
Jeez. Oh, boy. So, yeah.
But 2 thoughts on this. The monitoring count devices determined. That's great. I would wager that you probably don't know all the accounts and devices that were compromised. So
no, that's my point. That's my point. But they're on a very specific point there, and that is, if you have determined that a account was used, watch that account to see if people are trying to grab it again.
Yeah, it becomes like a little mini
honeypot, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Or honey account, honey data, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
Which makes sense.
Next is to implement core mitigations to inhibit re-exploitation, and I think that's kind of like the question mark. That you got to figure that out for yourself, and then implement a network-wide password reset, preferably with localhost access only, no remote changes allowed. To include domain accounts, local admin accounts, and machine and system accounts.
That is a huge ask for most organizations.
Which I was just about to say is going to break everything.
Wow, I don't disagree, but wow, that's going to break a lot of shit.
Yeah, it's going to
especially the domain the machine system accounts.
Yep.
I bet I would wager most organizations have no idea the impact that would have.
Yeah, and I have worked on incidents where where we strongly encouraged the customer to change their password, for service accounts and machine accounts like this, and nope, too much uncertainty.
Yeah,
that system's been there for 10 years. The people who wrote it are long gone. We're not changing that password.
That's one where you really would like to have a good, solid, privileged account management system in place.
Yeah,
that could handle that, and or test this like you would test DR.
Yeah, the thing that a lot of these things, by the way, make me realize that this is so much of this stuff comes into play when you're just fundamentally designing your IT infrastructure, and the thing that just comes to mind is that Chaos Monkey.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, for folks who may not recall, it's
Netflix.
Netflix has a script that will go around, and if I remember correctly, randomly turn off various virtual hosts in their cloud environment. And the concept is that you have to design from the get-go a resilient, self-healing, failover architecture.
Yeah.
And I think that's brilliant. I love that.
Yep.
And I bet 99.9% of organizations wouldn't possibly be able to sustain that.
And so I guess my point is, it should not be a big secret to anybody that these service accounts are problematic, and if you design that capability in, that you're going to have to change them periodically, and maybe on a moment's notice, you're probably going to implement things a little differently than you otherwise would.
But let's be honest, the average Windows admin doesn't think that way.
No,
I just don't.
I agree. And this again goes back to one of the things that I think we need to fundamentally work on in security, and that is making the line administrators and architects, IT administrators and IT architects, very familiar with not the in depths of how these attacks work, but that they exist. That you have to think about these sorts of things, because I think they're blissfully, well, not all, right? But many are blissfully ignorant.
Yeah, they're probably incredibly good Windows admins who just have never been exposed, or it's never been a core part of their function to care about security side of things. And so it's just not what they're paid to do.
Yeah, and I just want to say, if you happen to be an administrator listening to this podcast, we're not talking about you.
Because the fact that you're listening to this podcast tells us that you care about security.
Yes.
Which is good. But it's a tough gig. So, to give those guys some credit, they have to have a ton of very specific knowledge that a lot of security guys don't have.
Right. Absolutely.
And there's a finite amount of skill set any one person can possess. So then it comes back to, okay, then it's a matter of design. It's a matter of leadership in the right core competencies coming in at the right moment. So maybe it's more about designing from the beginning with the concept of, you tell the Windows admins, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter why, but know that these accounts may change password on a quarterly basis. Plan for that.
Exactly. Right.
Without having to put into their head all of the knowledge necessary for them to make that inference.
Right.
Anyway.
So moving on, next recommendation was to patch all systems for critical vulnerabilities and implement EMET, the Microsoft Enhanced Mitigation Exploit.
Also something
toolkit
that will break a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. I don't know that the default configuration breaks a bunch. You can use EMET to crater your computer.
Well, okay. Don't get me wrong. I like EMET. I think it's good. I'm just saying this isn't a set and forget. You've got to know what you're doing with EMET.
Yeah. It's
good,
powerful tool.
Yeah. It's not you just load it and go to lunch. That's
right.
Not the scenario here.
Right. But again, what occurred to me when I try to reconcile at least the patching all your vulnerabilities, particularly patching critical vulnerabilities, with what we saw up above in some of the malware that was being used. I suspect that it's quite likely the case that some of that malware didn't require the system to be unpatched, or the thing that I often see is that local privilege escalations are not considered critical, and so hey, we've patched all our criticals, we have our administrator, or we have our user base does not have local admin rights, and we don't consider local privesc to be critical. So yeah, there you go. Next recommendation is to encrypt your data. And one thing I want to point out is not only encrypt your data, but implement some key management, right? I mean, don't encrypt your data and put the keys right next to it. Think about it a little bit.
Yeah, maybe think through your entire key management lifecycle.
Yeah. Not that I've ever seen that go horribly wrong. Nope. Never. Next is implement long. Oh yeah. So they have some long-term mitigation recommendations, which are number one, to protect your credentials through least privilege and restriction of local accounts. Nothing surprising there. Limit lateral movement, and this is where I think it starts to get kind of interesting. They are starting to recognize something that I've been saying, that Active Directory is a force for evil sometimes, and so they're pointing out that you really need to think through how you architect your Active Directory, and that kind of goes into the next point, which is to segregate your admin access. And they had a couple of good points in here, especially down in the next major bullet, which is related to network segregation, and that is to ensure that your or less privileged accounts cannot access privileged systems by means of network controls, and that your privileged accounts, this is probably even more critical, your privileged accounts cannot access unprivileged or lower privileged devices. And I think the big part of that is because you have credential theft problems on those less secured systems. So,
but man, is that counterintuitive to most admins?
Oh, it is, and it takes, it's not the most straightforward thing to design. And again, this comes back to the point that these are some really fundamental design points in in your IT environment. These are not like we're going to come in and install some IPSs and firewalls. We're from security. We're here to help. No, this is like from the ground up. When you're designing your Active Directory forest, when you are laying out your network, when you're figuring out where your workstations are going to live versus your domain controllers versus your servers, these are really important design points that are going to help you. And it's interesting to see. This is really the first time I've actually seen this in a government publication. So maybe there's others, but there it is. Perimeter filtering, that's pretty basic. Application whitelisting, and yet another plug for EMET. And then centralizing all of your logs and implementing a standard baseline. So, using standard images, things like that. So I thought this was a great document, which for me to say that about an FBI flash is saying something.
So they finally got you.
Yeah. And we're not even supposed to read it, so there's that.
Jerry, if they've kidnapped your child, blink twice.
Oh boy. So
if there's someone there with a gun, blink 3 times.
Can't do it, man.
Wow.
So anyway, any final thoughts on that one?
That was good. There's some good stuff in here. I agree. These are non-trivial recommendations, though. But the one thing I go back to is on the DMZ isolation is, really, really, really test that you've got your firewall rules set up properly to actually limit and actually make the DMZ useful as a DMZ. There are so many times that I have seen firewall rules that either poorly or misconfigured, poorly configured. People didn't really understand the data flows, and those rules are far too open and not nearly restrictive enough, especially for DMZs. And so it's really not buying you much. But it gives you a false sense of security because you've got a firewall there and you're isolating. And unless you really, really dig down into the rules or have a good automated auditing system, most people think they're fine, and they're not.
Yeah, and also take some time to understand how lateral movement can happen. I have worked on quite a number of incidents in the past, and one thing that is painfully clear to me is that people do not generally understand all of the opportunity to move laterally from one network that they think is isolated from other parts of the network. And it really isn't. And it's not. The firewall rules are operating as intended. The organization and the administrators believed they pared it down to what was minimally necessary. And maybe it was, right, but it was too much. And some horrible things happened.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this is a great case for, I'm not a big fan of just throwing pen tests at problems, but having your own red team guys on staff to really adversarially test that sort of stuff, I think is really helpful. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of goes back to my big theme for the evening, I suppose, and that is, it really helps to have some kind of an understanding about how these attacks work. So you have an opportunity to design around those things. So anyway, moving on to our next story. This comes from Fortune magazine, and it's a three-part story regarding the Sony hack. And each one of the 3 parts is incredibly long.
And we already burned a half hour on the last story.
That's right. And I'm not really going to spend a ton of time. There aren't a lot of technical details, uncovered in this report. There are a lot. It's just a fantastic read. As somebody in IT security, it is a fantastic read. It kind of points out some of the subtleties that can happen when all of your email is made public.
Can I talk about Norse?
Yes, that was going to be my next stop. So go ahead.
I really want to. So, completely echoing and agree with you that it's a good read. But the article opens with Norse Corp, who, if you don't know them, they're a fairly small threat intelligence startup. Has a fantastic blog, by the way. I got to give them props for the
absolutely,
blog.
Yeah.
But the beginning of the article is basically Norse Corp relaying their experiences going for a pitch meeting at Sony Entertainment. Which, okay, great. But think about
mere
this.
weeks before the big event.
Weeks before. So the first thought I had was, wow, Norse Corp just completely spilled the beans on a private InfoSec-focused meeting.
Yeah.
I will never invite them to my organization if they're willing to go babble to the press if I have a problem shortly thereafter, because they have very unflattering things to say. And mind you, I have spent 10 years in sales, and sales guys will name drop like their life depends on it, and they violate NDAs left and right, and here it is in writing.
Yeah, I got a little shocked, says Tony Steinson, Norse's co-founder and chief technology officer. Their InfoSec was empty and their screens were logged in. Basically, the janitor can walk straight into their InfoSec department. If we were bad guys, we could have done something horrible.
There is just a lack of ethics to me in the fact that they were willing to say that about a potential customer. And to me, that really is a red flag about using a company like that. I think that's really, really poor form for them to have done that.
Yeah. I like to hope that there was more to the story about how that quote came to be, but yeah, it's really hard to defend.
Having been in sales for 10 years, you do not violate your customers' privacy or potential customers.
Unless, I guess the only thing I could say is maybe they got permission from Sony to talk about it. I don't know.
That is possible. I would doubt it. But if that is the case, then I would apologize to Norse Corp. But I would need to see proof of that. It more feels like a hit job from Norse talking about their experience.
Piling on,
talking about how unprofessional and insecure Sony's InfoSec department is, and we could just walk right in. And, when you invite a vendor into your work, you trust them. And you, even if without an NDA or anything like that, there's an implicit agreement that if you're going to open the kimono and talk about your problems with that particular vendor, they don't go blab about it to everybody.
Right.
So I was really disappointed in Norse Corp for, jumping on the bandwagon. Not that Sony doesn't deserve people piling on them, but this is pretty bad. It's sort of, it's like when Home Depot got hacked and all the ex-employees came out of the woodwork to slam Home Depot. Again, poor form, but that I can almost understand because that's employee-employer relations, and there was a lot of burned people. Companies should not, especially sales organizations for InfoSec companies, should not be participating in this sort of gossiping.
Yeah.
All right, that's completely secondary to the point, but I did really want to point that out.
So in part 2, there's just a fantastic paragraph because they are building up and most listeners probably are very familiar. They're building up the story about how the malware propagated out to all, well, not all, but many of their PCs and wiped them. And when they rebooted, they were unbootable. And holy cow, that's really advanced. But I want to read this. To avoid detection, the hackers immediately exited Sony's network after launching their destruction. The malware reported back to command and control servers out in cyberspace, allowing the intruders, wherever they were, to tally up their digital toll. Hackers typically use the simplest means necessary to accomplish their mission, and experts say there was nothing particularly sophisticated about the Sony hack. Ed Scotus, a white hat hacker who teaches cyber defense testing for corporate IT security professionals at the SANS Institute, says the skill level deployed at Sony looks pretty average. He puts its perpetrators on par with students in his mid-level classes. It shows the defenses at Sony were not particularly good, says Scotus. I didn't see the bad guys jumping over any extreme hurdles because there weren't any extreme hurdles in place. Wow.
Nice.
So yeah, take that, put that in your nation state pipe and smoke it, right?
Sony truther.
Oh boy. So
hopefully Ed listens to the show and he'll appreciate our job.
Yeah, good job, Ed.
Yes.
Damn, I've been just amazed at that quote since I read it. But anyhow, one of the more interesting things I found about this is kind of the human story, the human saga with their CEO and president, and the back and forth, and how their CEO is, throughout this event trying to find a new job, and then eventually decided to stay. And again, there weren't any like major revelations on how this particular breach happened, but there were a couple of things that I noticed. One of them was that Sony apparently had been common practice to use email as a long-term storage device.
I think that's incredibly common.
Yeah, and in fact, there was some effort to try to cut back on that, and some of the email that was disclosed was, hate mail railing against the decision. And then they go through, a brief but interesting discussion about how Sony is approaching kind of getting back to normal, and they're taking a probably a sensible approach that they've called their old contaminated network the black network, and they've created a white network. So anyway, they've segregated their network along the lines of what's been contaminated versus what's been rebuilt. They've implemented, I think, a pretty draconian email archiving scheme, and they have removed the ability for employees to install software. They have implemented two-factor authentication, which, by the way, wasn't two-factor authentication the thing that guy was digging on the Sarbanes-Oxley auditor in the article from back in like 2007, saying, we're not a bank, and if we were a bank, then we would be out of business, and if a business,
He was also the one who said, I'm not going to spend $10 million to mitigate a $1 million risk.
Yeah.
Which, at a point, makes sense.
But you got to
understand your risk.
Yeah, you got to understand what the hell your risk is, which he clearly did not. Oh, so yeah, there's that. And the thing that struck me as I was reading that, especially contrasting it with that previous interview back in 2006, 2007. This seems a lot like disaster recovery. Companies don't want to invest in this stuff. They don't want to. They don't want to swallow hard and take a proactive stance. So if back then, if they had spent the $10 million, this probably wouldn't have happened, or maybe it wouldn't have happened like it had. I don't, hard to say, but that's the thing that concerns me, or it just gets under my skin a little bit.
What do you think about, because this has been a common sort of debate. Do you think it's valid reporting to really lay all these emails out like this and share all this dirty laundry? Or is it just voyeurism and gossiping?
That's a good question. I don't know. It clearly is voyeurism. There's whether or not it is justified, I think is a philosophical question. I'm kind of glad for my own selfish purposes that they did it. But certainly if I were Sony, I would not have wanted to do that. It would be
certainly.
I'd be livid, right? And in fact, one of the stories one of the little story arcs they talk about is how Sony sicked their lawyers after a bunch of media outlets, including Fortune, telling them that they basically claiming all sorts of different legal strategies, that the data was trade secret and proprietary or copyrighted, or sounded pretty ridiculous to me. I think the reality is that there's not a legal defense against it, right? So whether or not it is moral, there's no legal barrier to doing so. So, all right. Anyhow, moving on to our next kind of train wreck of a story, comes from CSO Online, and if I can get this darn ad out of the way, I'll read the story to you. Yeah. Hang on. So Lieberman, Mandiant and Verizon are wrong on unstoppable threats. So Lieberman apparently is a vendor, and they are, I guess, dogging on Mandiant and Verizon, who are being overly opportunistic at these highly advanced threats, and they are more than happy to come in and help you clean up the mess that these super advanced attackers leave, and when they exploit their 0 days and all that sort of thing, but they won't tell you how to fix the problem, right? But they'll come in and charge you an arm and a leg, and and then they go on to, of course, Lieberman has some ideas like, that this would all be solved if you did a better job of administering your user IDs, which, oh, by the way, they make a enterprise password management tool. But that's neither here nor there, right? So Verizon and Mandiant, opportunistic, taking advantage of of these advanced attacks, not helping people avoid them, not writing data breach investigations reports, right? Not doing that. Not, clearly, because that would be helping. So, and Mandiant doesn't have reports either talking about.
I like when these stories come out because it's a valid point. Now, mind you, Lieberman has their own agenda. They're a privileged identity management company, and they're arguing that if you better controlled your identities, you would be able to limit these attacks or stop these attacks. That's its own debate. But this goes back to something you and I have talked about a number of times, which is saying I, from day one, felt when Mandiant came out and said there's no way you could have stopped this attack against Sony, that was a disservice to the organization and a disservice to, the InfoSec community at large, because it's not true.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what they're talking about here. I think the point of this article is that Mandiant and Verizon are their only horse in this race is to help you come in and pick up the pieces rather than help you try to avoid it in the first place. But I think at least in the case of Verizon, they spend a pretty incredible amount of money producing the annual data breach investigations report, among others, which is intended to actually do just that. And now, back on your point, though, I really, and I've said this at the time too, I really feel like that Mandiant letter was part of what they bought. Like that's, I don't know if that's part of the statement of work or, or what, but I have to believe that Mandiant and others, and I don't have any firsthand knowledge of this, so I'm completely talking out my rear end, but I've got to believe that these big incident response companies, in the same form that any other company would try to do when they look at getting into adjacent markets, right, is you try to become, kind of the full life cycle responder, which includes public relations and things like that. And I'm inclined to believe that that's part of, it was part of the package they bought. So, yeah. Take that.
Yeah, there's probably more to say, but I know we're running long on the show. But I like to see other vendors come out and talk about this. But fundamentally, I still feel that we have a problem if only vendor, in essence, sales. I don't know what's the term I want to use here, because here we've got a co-founder, or a president, I should say, Lieberman. If vendors are where you're getting your knowledge about InfoSec, you're probably missing out because they all have an agenda.
Yeah, agreed. So our last story for tonight comes from ITworld.com, and the title is Windows XP and Other Obsolete Systems Remain Critical to the Navy's Operations. Actually, that's the subtitle. The main title is U.S. Navy's Warfare Systems Command just paid millions to stay on Windows XP. So apparently the Navy, the Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command, nonetheless, apparently has 100,000 workstations that are still running Windows XP, at least as of May. And the Navy just spent $9.1 million to retain support for Windows XP, Office 2003, Exchange 2003, and Windows Server 2003. And there's the contract, I guess, has an option that could be worth up to almost $31 million that goes out to 2017. This drew a lot of criticism when it came out, but the reality is it might be an economical thing. I don't really know the reasoning behind why they did it. It's easy to look at them and point at them and laugh, but migrating 100,000 workstations is not a cheap endeavor.
But what I do find interesting is that they decided this was the best option. Now, that doesn't mean that they're right, but they didn't go the whitelisting route. They didn't go email. They went patches.
Well, that
could be.
Yeah, we don't know that they're not also doing those other things.
That's true, and it could be that they were forced to go down this path, right? They may not have had the option to really assess what is truly mitigating the risk. And
Right. And apparently some of these we don't really know the mix, but I guess some of these are on both classified and unclassified networks. The thing that concerns me more than anything is not that they're buying extended support, because what, if you're going to stay on XP like that, well, that's what you need to do, right? You need to pay for patches. The thing that concerns me is they're running Windows XP, which is
no kidding,
horrible.
And then but that tells me that that's a failure of asset management.
Yeah, long-term planning. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are in that boat. So then the other thing that occurred to me is, okay, so what are the ethics, if any, and the economics around this? Microsoft is now creating these patches. So they're doing the regression testing and they're finding security issues and they're throwing it back in XP for the people who pay. But they're only releasing it to the people who pay.
Right. Yeah.
And I understand that they have a business model and that they need to make money and that this is not a charity. And they want to encourage people to upgrade. And there's more than just patches that you get with upgrades around security. But you could also argue if they really cared about the hygiene and security of the internet, they would release those patches. They've already created them. I don't know. It's an interesting debate. I can see both sides of it.
Wow. Your Richard Stallman is showing.
I didn't say I agree. I said it was an interesting debate. I had no idea you knew that was my name for that.
So anyway, one of the interesting things down at the very bottom of this article is that apparently Windows XP still has more market share than OS X, which is kind of mind blowing. But I guess it started off at a much bigger base, so maybe that's not so surprising. But again, can we throw rocks at the Navy and say, oh, they wasted $10 million? Maybe, but I'm not as apt to throw them under the bus. I mean, it kind of seems like at least they're not. At least the article isn't that Navy got hacked because they were running old versions of XP without patches, and I don't know. I guess it's cool to dog on the government. So, damn you, Navy, you screwed up. There you go. How's that?
I have respect for the Navy. I'm not going to dog on them. But I will say that you don't want to be in this position. You don't want to be running XP or, we're coming up on Windows Server 2003 about to go end of life in July.
Yeah.
You need, you've got to figure out a way to move past these things. And it goes back to our earlier discussion, which is that you have to plan for upgrades and migrations and continuous changes. That's just the way IT works now.
Yeah,
these are not static. It's
not a surprise either, right? I guess that if there's a criticism to levy, it's that this is not a surprise. I mean, almost from the time XP was released, they were pretty clear about when it was going to go out of support. Yeah. And, so I guess there's that, I suppose. And the $9.1 million they just spent on support is not going towards replacing the system. So I suppose that's a fair criticism.
Well, they say they've got an active plan, but this is buying them time.
Yep.
It's
not their money. What do they care? That's a joke. That's a joke. Don't buy my house. It's a joke. I love you guys. Anyway, anything else?
No, I know we've burned up about an hour, so I want to be respectful of our listeners' time, and we can leave it there if you like.
All right, I think we'll do that. So thanks again for listening, and if you do like the podcast, give us some iTunes love. We really enjoy 5-star reviews. Always makes me very happy. You can find the podcast on the internet, www.defensivesecurity.org, where you will find the links to the stories we talked about tonight and all the back episodes and their respective links. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Khaled on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And, by the way, there's quite a few people listening to the podcast now. Twitter's really a great place to not only participate in the community, but just basically get kind of up-to-date news. So it is a time sink, though, but,
It is. And, hey, special shout-out to our Patreon donors.
Yes.
You guys are amazing. I am humbled and honored by your generosity. Thank you.
We will talk again next week. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for your time.
Bye. We should just drop that. nothing good can come.
All right.
from
Okay. So
continuing this.
just so the rest of the listeners know, there was an incredibly inflammatory joke that Jerry deleted from the show. But I just want you to know what happened. In the interest of full disclosure, I made a joke. Jerry thought the joke was too harsh. Jerry's probably right. But that's what happened.
Yep.
Carry on.
All right. Fair enough. So,
He's probably going to cut that too.
yeah. Whatever.
So now I want the listeners to know that multiple things have been cut.
And now what? Now what are you going to say?
You were dropped on a head during the formative years of reading facial expressions. I don't know. It could be many things.
Oh, yeah. I was definitely dropped on my head a whole bunch.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Get back in your box. All right, we should probably do a show, shouldn't we?
Oh, shit. We were going to do that, weren't we? So, yeah.
Because what I was originally thinking about was, wouldn't it be cool if we could have...
You're just trying to take over this goddamn show.
It took you this long to figure it out. So what I was thinking is that for my show, we would lose a lot of listeners if they knew.
I know.
There's another soundbite for you.
Well, I couldn't find an emoji for that. Well, it was the hashtag wars.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.